I'm going to share, I would put my journey in 3 stages, and I'll share those with you now. The first is the buildup. And those of you guys that know me, I'm a high energy guy. That's probably not a surprise to those of you that know me. But what's crazy is that went back to my childhood. My dad was like exhausted because he's like, Michael, you always had to be doing something as a kid. And what's interesting as I reflect back on that probably made me a little bit higher risk of developing anxiety later in my life. But I just didn't know that, as the guy who always had to be doing something and chasing the next thing. But, as I went through my life, stress and anxiety I really didn't feel like I dealt with it, more than the normal person. I'd have exams and I'd be stressed, or I'd have a project at work and be stressed, or I'd move and it was stressful. But, we get loads of stress and then we kind of shed them, at times in our life if things are good, right? And I felt like I was able to shed stress whenever it hit me for a period of time. The problem was in 2012, in the fall of 2012, that stopped happening. And all of a sudden things started to compound, and little things that I was able to shed, I wasn't able to shed anymore. And I went into the holiday break being like, look, I feel something brewing inside me. I just don't know what it is, but it's got to have a breaking point. And I was telling the girl I was dating at the time, like, something just doesn't feel right. Like something is building. And I went home to Ohio for the holidays and thought that would be my respite, right? To disconnect and recharge. Unfortunately, I was anxious and stressed the entire time I was back in Ohio, to the point where my parents were like, are you okay? You're kind of jittery. And I started to feel nauseous and just not myself. So I flew back to Minneapolis, and the morning of New Year's Day, so 2 a.m. New Year's morning, I wake up and I have my first panic attack. And for those of y'all that haven't had one, let me describe it to you. Denise did a little bit of it. I would never wish it on my worst enemy, because like Denise said, it is a total out of body experience. You are shaking, you are wanting to crawl out of your skin. Your heart is racing out of your chest. You can't breathe. And everybody talks about, focus on your breath. You can't do that with someone who's having a panic attack. Chills, shaking, dry heaving, that feeling, when you have the flu and you're like, God, I would feel so much better if I threw up. That's what you have in the depths of a panic attack, but you can't throw up. And then you're so utterly exhausted from it. And then you go through this thing and you just feel so isolated and alone. Like there's nobody else in America that could have been feeling what I was feeling. Like that was what was going on in my head. I just felt very isolated and very alone. And that's the first. There's 2 things I wish I knew when I started this journey. The first thing I wish I knew was that I wasn't alone. Back in 2012, people weren't openly talking about mental health, right? And saying you're not alone, and it's okay to not be okay, and to share your struggles. And if you did share your struggle, it was like, hey, maybe Klaus can't handle his job. Maybe Klaus has too much on his plate. Like, ooh, Klaus has got problems. That was the thing that I was telling myself at the time, because it was just the thing that nobody talked about. So here's the problem with that is when you're experiencing anxiety, you start to think irrational thoughts, the whole fight or flight thing that Denise talked about. Like I was thinking like, damn, I got to quit my job. Like I can't do this. Like, because I was trying to do anything to get away from a trigger of anxiety. The problem was everything triggered me. So I'm like, I got to quit my job. I got to break up with my girlfriend. I got to move back home. I'll never forget, a week after my first panic attack, I'm in the office. My dad sent me a text. He's like, hey, Michael, can you send a check-in for this thing him and I were doing together? You would have thought he sentenced me to 10 years of hard labor. Like I literally broke. I was like, I don't want to send the check. Like, oh my God, I have to write a check. I got to put it in an envelope. I got to address the envelope. I got to mail it. I mean, I was wrecked. So then here's where the vortex gets away from you. So I'm isolated and alone, thinking irrational thoughts. And then I started beating myself up, because I'm like, well, why the hell am I like, I can't even write a freaking check, to send this thing in. Like, what the hell's the matter with me? Like, you got to get your shit together, dude. Well, that's like the last thing you want to be doing, is beating yourself up when you go through this. So unfortunately, like that was the vortex that I started to spin down. And I mean, I hate to oversimplify, but that was my life for the better part of 3 years. And let me tell you what an average day was for me. And I wish I was embellishing, but I'm not. I had insomnia. I would wake up at 2 a.m. almost every night, unable to sleep. My mind would be racing. I called it mental ping pong. The problem with anxiety is once you have a panic attack, you're scared to death you're going to have another panic attack. So then you get scared of having a panic attack. So then you panic, and guess what? You have a panic attack. So then I'm completely exhausted. I finally fall back asleep around 5:30 or 6 a.m. And then 45 minutes later, my alarm goes off and I got to get up for work. Every single day, without fail, I would dry heave before going into the office because I just had so much pressure. So I would dry heave. And then, as you can imagine, I was freaking exhausted. Like, Denise, I don't have a freaking clue how you did it with kids. I was just a single guy. But I mean, I was exhausted from 9 to 5 every day. And the thing was, like, I faked it pretty well for y'all because a lot of people didn't know what was going on. Again, you don't know what the struggle is internally, right? And then I'm not ashamed to say, like, when 5 p.m. hit, I had a couple drinks immediately after work because I'm like, I've got to, like, calm down because I knew I was about to start another battle at 2 a.m. the next morning. I mean, it sucks. Now, you're probably saying two things to yourself. Klaus, I mean, that's pretty unsustainable. The answer is yes. It was absolutely unsustainable. I was that guy, you know, those rope swings, you know, you'd like swing the rope and then you'd fly off into the pond as a kid. I was on the rope swinging, but the other side of the rope was a canyon. It wasn't a lake. And so I'm on this rope and I don't want to hold on to the rope any longer, but I know I don't want to be jumping into no canyon, right? So I just was kind of there swinging at the end of the rope, holding on for the better part of 3 years. The second thing you might be saying to yourself is, well, why didn't you get help? The answer is I did. Within the first week of my first panic attack, I went to a psychologist. I went to my general physician. He put me on antidepressants. Here's the second thing I wish I knew. Therapy is like dating. It is not always a match at first. And it is the same thing with antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds. Nobody told me that. So the problem is I meet with my first counselor. I have a couple sessions. He at one point says to me, dude, I don't know what's wrong with you. Okay, not something to tell a guy who's in the depths of anxiety. Okay. The other thing about antidepressants, they can really F with your head. Nobody told me these things. So when you're already being irrational and you're already beating yourself up, and then you are desperate to try and get help, then you go seek help, and it actually might make the situation worse at first. Nobody told me about that. So I didn't have the support system and I didn't have the knowledge about what would take place. So here I am holding on to the end of the rope for the better part of 3 years. Summer of 2016 comes along. You know, I'm a Christian, so I'm just going to throw out there a God reference. This to me can only be described as a God thing. I got signed up for a leadership seminar with Mills. And as part of this seminar, you take these assessments and then you meet with a psychologist and they go through your assessments with you. So I walk in, I meet with the counselor or with the psychologist, and toward the end of our discussion, I was like, man, hey, I'm really struggling with some stuff right now. Like, would you be open to having, a professional working relationship outside of this discussion? Her name was Lori. Thank God she said yes. I had found the right match. And over the next 18 months, Lori and I worked together, unpacked stuff as far back as my childhood. Two things about me. One is I have a not good enough complex. I never think I'm enough. When you add anxiety onto that, then I really didn't think I was good enough. And again, down the vortex we go. The second was, most of you don't know this, my sister passed away when I was 11. She was about 2 years old. And we were in a session once, and Lori just had this way of asking questions that like went to the depths of my soul. And she asked me one question about my sister. And I bawled uncontrollably for 30 minutes. Like, she had just unpacked something that I had been holding on to for 20 years and didn't even realize it. That's the power of good therapy. As Denise mentioned, though, like, I wish I could tell you, oh, okay, like I worked with Lori and everything's great. Like, no, anxiety is a war I will face the rest of my life. It's part of who I am. It doesn't define who I am. But I'm winning battles and fighting battles every day. And I'll give you another great example of that recently. Rebecca Robinson, who's in finance with us, I don't know if she's on the call, but Rebecca reached out to me at the beginning of the year. This is the other strength about sharing your story is you build, advocates and partnerships and support groups. Rebecca said, "Hey, have you checked out Spring Health yet? Because I think it's awesome." And I was like, you know what? What a great push for me. Like, if somebody's going to give you something, take it. And I haven't even taken advantage of the free options that are available to us on Spring Health. So I've had 3 sessions with a counselor now on Spring Health. I've had 2 with a psychiatrist. And about 2 months ago, the psychiatrist put me on a different medication that has been as much of a game changer for me as Lori was 5 years ago. So it's my way of sharing to you guys, like, the journey is never done. So as Denise said, I hope that what we have shared speaks to at least one of you, because if one of you is impacted by this, then it is 100% worth it for both Denise and I. And if you are not part of the 40% of people who have some sort of struggle with anxiety or depression, and you're on the other 60%, just making you guys aware of that this is out there. And as Lori told me, she goes, "Mike, when you walked into that meeting, that first meeting at Starbucks," she goes, "you looked like a guy who had everything together." She goes, "But it only took me 1 or 2 sessions to realize you were an absolute mess inside." So that is my way of sharing with you that of the 400 people on this call, there are some of us on this call that are an absolute mess. And being able to share that openly, and then not judge and support those around you, there's great power in that. So